Welcome back to Trust Leaks, the podcast where we uncover the small experience gaps that quietly cost businesses trust, retention, and growth. I'm Sandra Martini, founder of the Martini Way, the Get It Done Right community, and of course, host of this podcast, Trust Leaks. In our last episode, we talked about why responsiveness isn't enough and why real trust is built through responsibility and ownership. Today, however, I want to talk about another leadership habit that feels right but often creates confusion for your clients. And that thing is consensus. Alignment matters, collaboration matters, but when too many voices shape the client experience, that clarity disappears. And without clarity, trust can't take root. Let's jump in. Okay, why does consensus feel like the right move? Well, modern teams value collaboration. Leadership wants buy-in, fairness, alignment, so consensus feels both respectful and inclusive. We want everyone to have a say. However, clients don't experience internal collaboration. They experience the output. What is the result of that collaboration? Clients don't want to see how the decisions are made. They just want to know what they are and understand what's happening. I saw a TV show recently that said, everybody loves sausage until you see how it's made. Sometimes that can be with the way decisions are when you go through a collaborative process. And clients don't need to be in the up and down and the round and the through and the great suggestions and the not so great. It just blows their mind. So we don't want to do that. Consensus can actually create confusion for clients. Sometimes there's mixed messages, there's shifting timelines, multiple points of contact, and different interpretations of what success means for this thing that you're doing. What that leads to? Uncertainty, hesitation, loss of confidence. They're just not sure, okay, are we done? Are we moving forward? I kind of like that one. Why are we now over here? So it introduces all these things that never need to be part of the mix. When consensus includes everybody in the decision-making process, from a client experience perspective, it doesn't look like anyone is clearly leading. And so they're unsure, they're hesitant. You see, clarity is a leadership responsibility. One voice, one direction, one clear path forward. And by leadership in this case, I mean leadership of the project, the client. Who owns this? Who has the final decision-making ability on this, whatever this happens to be? Decisions are explained. They're not debated when you have ownership. The next steps are obvious. The progress is framed consistently. And there's no confusion. So all of the collaboration can take place over here. And then the decision, one decision maker brings it to the client and says, this is the direction we're going in. Here's what we're doing. See, clarity doesn't require agreement. It requires that level of ownership. And that level of ownership needs to be clearly communicated to everybody involved, both on the team side and on the client side. One of the places that I often see clarity break down inside businesses is when there's too many decision makers. There's not a final owner. Or those who want or are giving input, they might be afraid of being wrong or have a fear of upsetting internal stakeholders. I just experienced this with a client last week. The client has a public facing form of all of their options, all of the ways to work with them. And I was asked to review this. I reviewed it and I noticed some inconsistencies, pretty big ones. And so I brought it to the person who created the document. I said, hey, A, B, and C should really be C, D, and E. Okay. And you can remove this, and that doesn't work in this environment. And she came back and she said, this was just approved in December. And I said, okay, it's February and we need to update it. And she said, no, it's been approved. I said, understood. And it needs to be updated. No, no, it needs to be approved. It's been approved, and if you want anything changed, the CEO will have to tell me to do it. I said, okay. I texted the CEO. I said, blah, 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 blah. And he said, oh my goodness, how did that slip through? Can you communicate to this person to make it happen? Screenshot of the text, sent it to the person, and she said, okay. There was this fear that once management had approved something, it was locked in stone. It was never going to change. And everything we do, everything we are, is there's change. Change happens. Sometimes you don't need to change something 2 months later. Sometimes you might need to change it a week later. So in this case, someone had a fear of upsetting an internal stakeholder on something she believed was set in stone. Nothing is set in stone. There are always improvements we can make. So when it comes to how clarity sometimes breaks down, one, it can be too many cooks in the kitchen. Another one can be no final owner and fear of being wrong. So who owns the final call for the client experience? And this is not necessarily a single question. It may be a by project question. On my team, I own most of the final decisions when it comes to clients and client experiences. However, there's one client that I don't. I'm there in a support role and my team leads, and that's completely okay. And the client knows, okay, go to Sandy for this, go to team for that. And team in this case is one specific person. So don't get too caught up in it has to be one person and the same person all the time. It can be one person for each project. As long as everything as mentioned before is clearly communicated, both internally and client facing externally. So, with all of this collaboration going on, how do you balance it without losing client trust? And I alluded to it earlier. It's very simple. You collaborate internally, you decide privately, okay? Privately amongst the core stakeholders internal to your team or your business. And then you communicate it clearly, internally and externally. Okay, everybody's on the same page. Susie is running this project. Susie has final decision. One of the things I love to do, I use Slack with a lot of my clients. And one of the things we love to do is have a quick poll. Okay, here's what we're thinking about. Quick poll. So everyone is invited to go ahead and voice an opinion on something, add new options if they wish. And at the end of the day, the decision is made by the person who owns that project. Okay, but we always allow everyone to go ahead and jump in with a say because you never know where your best ideas will come from. And the client isn't involved in any of that, nor should they be. So, from a systems perspective, balancing collaboration is simply a case of defining decision rights. What decisions can be made by whom? Assigning client facing ownership. So, who's the one talking to the client about this or clients? In all cases, the most important thing here is to protect your client from the internal noise. So as we go back and forth, whiteboard all thoughts and processes, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. Because in a brainstorm, everything goes up on the wall. Client doesn't need to be part of that. Their head will just start spinning. One of the things that I like to tell clients who have large client bases is that alignment happens behind the scenes. Clarity is what shows up front. Okay, you want your client to know that the team is aligned and clear. And behind the scenes, you want to know that everybody has weighed in and everyone has given their opinion, and you feel really strong about what you're bringing to bear. All right. Consensus feels safe, but clarity is what builds confidence. Confidence is one of the key factors leading to increased trust. Clients don't need to know every opinion, every debate, or every internal consideration. They need to know what's the decision, what's happening, why does it matter, and what's happening next. Done. So as you think about your business, ask yourself this: where might consensus be replacing clarity and quietly eroding trust? Thanks for listening to Trust Leaks today. If this episode resonated, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss future conversations about trust, leadership, and sustainable growth. Until next time, Remember, clarity is one of the most powerful trust signals you can give. Talk to you soon.